The Greco-Persian Wars shook the ancient world and set the stage for the age that followed them. But equally important to the battles of Salamis and Plataea is the Ionian Revolt, the initial spark that caused conflict to flare up between Persia and the Greeks. The rebellion that erupted here and the retribution that followed was only the first brutal round in this conflict, and we shall be covering it in today's episode. During the Greek Dark Ages, many Greek colonies sprang up across the Mediterranean, yet nowhere was the colonisation as wholesale as in Ionia. By the 6th century BC, many of the wealthiest Greek cities were Ionian. Of the great cities of Ionia, the greatest by far was Miletus. Possessing 4 mighty harbours, it was the prime trade hub of the Greek world, and it also established itself as the birthplace of Greek philosophy. Miletus was thus the jewel in the crown of Ionia, and it wasn't long before ambitious outsiders began trying to seize that crown for themselves. First came the Lydians, a people from western Anatolia, who led several wars of conquest in Ionia. They eventually established their dominance over most of the area, but they wouldn't enjoy it for long. In 547, the Persian king Cyrus invaded Lydia, besieged its capital, and killed its king. With the conquest of Lydia, the Ionian cities were left in limbo for a few months, before Cyrus dispatched one of his top generals, Harpagus, to bring the Ionians to heel, which he soon did. Harpagus briskly quashed any notions of Ionian independence, and most cities were content to go quietly. Only Miletus, as the greatest and most powerful, was allowed some nominal independence. Officially, it was an ally of Persia, although in reality it was a subject and nothing more. And in this we can once again see the Persian genius for lulling its subjects into accepting their new masters. Wherever they went, the Persians made sure to respect local traditions and tried to work within local structures of power. The Greek gods were always respected. In the political sphere, meanwhile, the Persians administered Ionia through a network of tyrants, each one appointed by the Persian satrap or governor of Sardis. For the first few decades of Persian rule, things went smoothly enough, but already a sense of unease was there. Firstly, the use of tyrants to rule the cities proved to have its problems. It frequently meant that the Persians were sucked into the Greeks' constant feuding and factionalism, not a recipe for stability. The Persian patronage of the Greek gods also bore pitiful results, for the Greeks lacked a single defined priestly ruling class like the priests of Marduk in Babylon, so they were stuck with the unpopular and unstable tyrants. Ruling as a Greek tyrant was always a delicate balancing act between keeping the people happy and not alienating the aristocracy. But the tyrants in Ionia were lumped with a third consideration, keeping their Persian masters happy. A consideration that made the first two far harder. Mainland Greece was slowly ditching its tyrants in favour of democracies or oligarchies. Ionia, by contrast, seemed stuck in the past, and the desire for liberty grew. It was the turbulent and xenophobic lower classes who felt this way the most. With effortless bigotry, they looked down upon the Persians as barbarians, but they grew to despise their tyrants even more, as weaklings and the stooges of their foreign overlords. The Ionians were becoming dangerously disillusioned and disgusted with their tyrants. For them, new styles of governance were needed. So, as the Ionian tyrants were forced to fend off both the hatred of the lower classes as well as the jealousy of their fellow aristocrats, they might well find themselves being toppled. And if that happened, well then the Persians really would have a mess on their hands. The rise of King Darius in 522 increased concerns, as the new King of Kings introduced new taxes upon commerce, alienating Ionian merchants. To govern this important western frontier, Darius appointed his loyal brother, Artaphernes, a savvy operator and efficient governor. A wise choice, for all too soon Darius would have dire need of loyal deputies in the west. The Ionian question, long left open, would soon get its answer. In 513, King Darius bridged the Bosphorus with a great flotilla of ships and led a mighty army into Europe. His aim? Scythia. So up he went, subjugating Thracian tribes as he marched, until he reached the river Ister, what we today call the Danube. Another bridge was constructed here using Ionian ships, leaving them to hold the fort while he continued into Scythia. But while he was busy doing that, the Ionian tyrants were just milling around at the Danubian bridge, waiting for their master to return. Then one day, Miltiades, the tyrant of the Thracian Chersonese, came up with a bold plan. Darius was on the long march back from the banks of the Volga, but what if the Ionians destroyed the bridge over the Danube? It was autumn now, and Miltiades argued that Darius's army would not be able to survive the oncoming winter, which promised icy weather and Scythian raids. Once that happened, Persia would be thrown into chaos, and freedom would surely be theirs. There was a perking of ears among the assembled tyrants, and for a brief moment they giddily agreed to the plan, before Histiaeus, the tyrant of Miletus, piped up and brought them back to reality. Histiaeus pointed out the terrible risks of such a scheme, and the Ionians soon changed their mind. The bridge stayed, Darius returned, all mention of treachery was suppressed. If this was a test of the Ionians' loyalty, it was a test they barely passed. With Darius now safe and sound back inside imperial territory, he was in a generous mood. He called upon Histiaeus, his favourite, and asked whether he had any wish of the great king. The tyrant humbly replied that if he only might be granted a tiny portion of the king's new satrapy in Thrace, he would be deeply grateful. Darius assented, and Histiaeus was given the valuable region of Myrcynus. It sat at the head of a wide river, and possessed both rich silver mines and timber for ships. A juicy prize indeed, perhaps too juicy. Histiaeus was both ambitious and clever, and a few high-ranking Persians suggested that it might be unwise to give such a man control over both the great city of Miletus and Myrcynus. Darius saw the wisdom in this, but it wouldn't do for the most powerful man on earth to withdraw his gifts. So he resolved to be even more generous, and gave Histiaeus the immensely prestigious title of Royal Table Companion. Of course, Darius would shortly be leaving home, and he would be taking his table with him, so Histiaeus would have to wave all his lands goodbye. In 511, Histiaeus selected his nephew Aristagoras as his stand-in in Miletus and Myrcynus, and glumly joined his king on the royal road back to the heart of Persia. But if Darius thought that he had cleverly kept Miletus at bay, he had made one oversight. The new tyrant of Miletus, Aristagoras, was quickly proving himself to be just as clever and just as ambitious as his uncle Histiaeus, and it would be he who finally fired the starting pistol on the Ionian revolt. In 510, the tyrant of Athens was deposed, a turn of events that was watched with bated breath in Ionia, and calls for similar action began to grow. Class hatred seethed as the lower classes clamoured for democracy, and Aristagoras began to feel the pressure. In 500, perhaps seeking a way out of Miletus, Aristagoras ventured to the satrapal court of Artaphernes, Darius's brother, at Sardis. He arrived with a simple plan: the conquest of the Aegean island of Naxos. Naxos was rich and strategically located in the central Aegean, yet it was also vulnerable, for it was a city suffering from a bout of internal strife. Aristagoras had gained contacts inside the city. If Artaphernes supplied ships and men, Aristagoras was sure that Naxos would be theirs. So after some chin-rubbing and eyebrow-furrowing, Artaphernes got royal assent from his brother, and he gave Aristagoras the thumbs up. The Milesian tyrant cracked his knuckles and prepared to add a third city-state to his collection. What could go wrong? Well, as it turned out, a lot. The expedition was an unmitigated disaster, and to make things worse, his co-commander was Artaphernes' cousin, who quickly shifted all blame for the failure onto Aristagoras. The tyrant of Miletus could see the walls closing in on him. Miletus seethed with class hatreds, and the calls for liberty continued to grow. His own plans were in ruin, and now Artaphernes' cousin was dripping poison in his ear. Furthermore, he also received a secret message from his uncle Histiaeus urging him to rebel. Histiaeus urged this because he wished to return home, and he believed that Darius would allow him to return west if Ionia revolted. Artaphernes ordered Aristagoras' removal, but Aristagoras claimed the initiative. All of a sudden he declared that he was stepping down as tyrant of Miletus. In his place, Miletus would be a democracy. This calculated act had its desired effect. The spark of liberty quickly took hold among the discontented Milesians, before spreading like a roaring fire up and down Ionia. All along the coast, the tyrants were cast down, and democracies sprang up in their place. The revolt, and the Greco-Persian Wars, had begun. Aristagoras had saved his own skin for the time being, but at what cost? The Ionians were alone in their struggle against Darius. If they had any hope of keeping their freedoms, they would need allies, and strong ones at that. Once the Persians got their act together, they would not be merciful. So with this weighing on his mind, Aristagoras boarded a ship for Greece. He had two destinations in mind. First on the list was Sparta. He arrived in Sparta with high hopes, but if he believed that Cleomenes, Sparta's king, would help him, he was sorely mistaken. Cleomenes' chief concern was Argos, Sparta's arch-nemesis in the Peloponnese, and furthermore, Disagreements between Cleomenes and Demaratus, his co-king, meant that Cleomenes was uneasy about leaving on a madcap campaign in Ionia. Nothing Aristagoras could say would sway him. He sailed on to Athens, where he hoped he would get a warmer reception. Luckily for him, a war spirit was in the air. Back in 507, the Athenians had sent an embassy to Artaphernes to secure an alliance. Artaphernes said that this would be possible on the conditions that the Athenians submitted to Persian authority. The embassy agreed, but the Athenians back home were not happy. On top of this, Artaphernes also asked them to take back Hippias, their former tyrant. They refused, and some bad blood had built up as a result. For these reasons, the Athenians decided to send a complement of 20 ships to Ionia. Certainly not a huge amount, but it should be noted that Athens was not yet the naval power that history would remember it as. Athens aside, only the small city of Eretria agreed to help Aristagoras with 5 ships. A scant consolation, for the armies of the great king were now mobilising, and the war would begin in earnest. Nevertheless, the Ionians remained upbeat and decided to go on the offensive. They sent forces north to capture Byzantium and other cities around the Hellespont. Then, in 498, they assembled a larger force at Ephesus and prepared to take the fight to Artaphernes himself. Marching inland from Ephesus, they came crashing down upon Sardis. They smashed into the lower walls, but they were unable to capture Artaphernes on the Acropolis. Lacking the necessary siege engines, they put the lower town to the torch and began a shaky retreat. With this initial thrust into Persian territory, the Ionians began to realise that this would be no easy war. As they fell back to the coast, they were harried by the Persians, before the two sides finally met in battle outside Ephesus, where the Ionians suffered a crushing defeat. No more offensives for them then. The attack on Sardis had been a grievous insult to Darius' honour and prestige, but a failure for the most part. However, the shock of the defeat spurred the Cypriots and the Carians into joining the revolt against Persia, so it wasn't all bad. The Athenians, spooked by the defeat, lost heart and fled back home. From here on out, the Ionians were stuck on the back foot. The Persians began besieging their cities one by one, so that by 497 Miletus was the only city left defiant on the mainland. By now, the raging flames of revolt had been stamped down into smouldering bushfires, as Cyprus was subdued despite Ionian assistance, and the rebels fragmented. For his part, Aristagoras travelled to Myrcinus, his uncle Histiaeus' fiefdom in Thrace, to gather funds for the war, but while he was there he was anticlimactically slain by the locals. The Persians were less successful in Caria, a region south of Ionia, where the local Persian army was massacred in an ambush in 496, but it was clear that the revolt's days were numbered. Their last hope lay in the Ionian war fleet, still 350 ships strong. They still controlled the waves, so all was not lost. Finally, in 494, the Persian war fleet sailed forth into Ionian waters, ready to smash the rebels once and for all. The Ionians resolved to confront them in battle, so after a standoff lasting a few days, they clashed at an island called Lade. The Ionians brought with them 350 ships, while the Persians had 600. It would be freedom or death. The two fleets advanced against one another, and the Ionians braced themselves for the fight of their lives. Yet in the choice between freedom and death, some had chosen a third option. Persian agents had been active in the Ionian camp and bribery was afoot. So just as the battle was about to begin, several Samian ships turned tail and fled. A few others followed, and the remainder of the Ionian fleet was surrounded and obliterated. The Ionians lost 246 ships, the Persians only 57. Miletus had been able to stave off Persian attack thus far, but now the Persians blockaded it by both land and sea. The defences quickly collapsed, and the city, stormed, sacked and obliterated, was reduced to rubble. Miletus aside, however, the Persians weren't too harsh. The imperial authorities, led by Artaphernes, set about restoring order and rebuilding. The last pathetic splutters of resistance came from none other than Histiaeus himself. Darius unwisely allowed him to return to Sardis, where Artaphernes, who greatly disliked Histiaeus, warned him in no uncertain terms that he believed him to be behind the Ionian revolt. He did this because Darius' royal protection prevented him from getting at Histiaeus, and he wished to make him openly defect to the Ionians so he could punish him. Sure enough, Histiaeus feared for his life and fled Sardis. He spent the next few years adventuring before he was finally captured in the region of Mysia and brought before Artaphernes. Despite this, he was confident that he could worm his way back into Darius' good books if only he could be granted an audience with the great king. Artaphernes did not give him the chance, and Histiaeus was summarily executed. With him perished the Ionian revolt. Darius was apparently saddened by his favourite's death, and gave Histiaeus an honourable burial. All things considered, it was probably better than he deserved. All Ionia's leaders were now dead or exiled. The game was up. Ionia had lost its gamble for freedom, and the price it paid was a heavy one. Ionia was left a ravaged wasteland, Miletus a smoking pile of rubble. The vengeance of the great king was swift and terrible indeed, a lesson brought most terrifyingly home for the Athenians. They had kicked the King of Kings when he was down, and now he was coming for revenge. Tales told of how Darius, upon hearing of the Athenians' involvement, selected one of his slaves to whisper the same thing in his ears day after day. "Master, remember the Athenians." Every time he sat down for a meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." Darius did not forget, nor did he forgive. He would have his revenge, and it was coming far sooner than the Athenians would like.